Hello everyone, welcome to Kalam's answer writing. So we've opened up the section on disaster management, right? So the next 2 days also I'm going to discuss questions on disaster management. So some themes are quite recurrent in disaster management. Like for example, the questions on NDMA guidelines, what NDMA does in such a certain situations like earthquakes, etc., etc. These things are usually important. And the infrastructure we have in relation to disaster management, like the Disaster Management Act, and the kinds of bodies it creates. Like for example, the Disaster Management Act creates National Disaster Management Authority, State Disaster Management Authority, and the local counterparts. In addition to this, we have set up a separate force called the Disaster Response Force at the national level, state level, and so on, right? In addition to this, in order to do enough research on disaster, we've also set up what? The National Institute of Disaster Management, right? National Institute of Disaster Management. So I want you to locate this National Institute of Disaster Management and tell me where this is located or where it is going to be located. So let's look at this particular question. How important are vulnerability and risk assessment for pre-disaster management? And as an administrator, what are the key areas that you would focus on disaster management system? So the first thing is to talk about the importance. That is going to be the first part of my side heading. The second part of my side heading is going to be talk about the measures that I am going to take, right? See, this is not an ethics based question, so you cannot say I am going to do this, I am going to do it. Write it in third person. Even in ethics, you have to write things in a third person perspective until and unless you handle the case studies, right? So when you write case studies, you can usually use your I will do this, I will do that, but otherwise write the exam in a third person manner because that is more formal. So what is the kind of introduction, body, and conclusion that you can manage for this particular question? So firstly, the introduction is definitely going to talk about the concept of disaster first thing. That is one generic way to start your answer, or you could also talk about disaster management. You could talk about either of these things. Moving forward in the body, you're supposed to talk about two things. First thing is the importance of vulnerability and risk assessment, right? I am writing it in the short form. And the second thing is the importance, as in not the importance, sorry, but it is asking you about the steps that you would take as an administrator in order to handle the situation of disaster management. And the third thing is to talk about the conclusion, because every answer has an introduction and a body and a conclusion. Now I want you to keep in mind, when you write the second side heading of this particular answer, when you talk about the different steps that are related to this particular answer in related to disaster management, you have to segregate your answer into three things. You have to talk about the steps that you would take in the pre-disaster situation, during the disaster as in immediately after the disaster situation, and post-disaster rehabilitation, and so on. So these three aspects, if you deal with these three components, if you deal with, you're going to provide the examiner with a very rich answer, and that is eventually going to fetch you a lot of marks. Now let's think about the kind of diagrams that we can develop. So in this particular question, there is usually a diagram on what? There is a diagram on disaster life cycle. I want you to Google this. There is a very famous diagram on disaster life cycle, and a lot of toppers, a lot of aspirants usually put that diagram at least in one answer in relation to disaster management. You need to have that in your notes, and something like that can be put in your answer. In addition to this question is on generic disaster management. Why not identify the kind of disasters India has? Maybe draw an Indian map and show that the coastline is prone to cyclones and tsunamis. You could also show the examiner that the tectonic areas, as in the north and northwest, are prone to what? They are basically tectonically active regions. Western Ghats are prone to lots of landslides, right? Himalayas are prone to avalanches and so on. And in addition to this, what other disasters do we have? If you look at the northeast area of our country, as in Assam, Brahmaputra region, what is the major problem we face there? The major problem we face there is that of the flood situation, especially because there is too much monsoon firstly, and there is also rain coming from the Brahmaputra from Chinese side, right? So all this is going to create a situation of huge water buildup in northeast, and this has led to a lot of floods. In addition to this, there is also a river called Sorrow of Bihar. Write it down in the comment section. And that also has been known to create a lot of floods. So these are the kind of things that you can identify in your answer, and by doing so you will be able to impress the examiner by providing this additional information. See, whenever you provide this additional information, it is only an addition. That is going to fetch you extra marks, but the basic crux is obtained, as in the basic meat of your marks is going to come from addressing the answer. First address the answer properly, then do your value addition. This value addition could be a diagram, this value addition could be a quote, right? It could be a flowchart. Any of these things can be done. Now let's move forward. Look at the sample answer. So here is the sample answer. India is vulnerable to a lot of disasters, right? We are vulnerable to a large number of disasters, and to varying degrees as per the National Disaster Management Authority. This is what NDMA has said. And he's giving you example. He's basically trying to establish the fact that India is prone to a lot of disasters. One is that 59% of the country is earthquake prone. 40 million hectares of the country is flood prone area. 80% of the coastline is cyclone prone. Right. So he is basically trying to give you figures and establish data to tell you that a lot of India's subcontinent, as in Indian region, is prone to disasters. In addition to this, of course, he could talk about different events that have transpired. Why just talk about the areas that are prone to disasters? Talk about the disasters that have occurred. Talk about the super cyclone in Odisha 1999. Talk about 2004 tsunami. You could talk about the recent floods, and there are several umpteen number of cyclones, fail in this, fail in that, Oki, and so on. All these things can be talked about. Earthquakes can be talked about, right? So talk about, give examples, Bhuj earthquake and so on. That is also going to densify your answer. Now moving forward, vulnerability and risk assessment is taking stock of our present vulnerabilities. It involves grading the regions in our country to risks of different disasters, right? Now this is sample vulnerability assessment. This is the area in which you have land degradation. This area is earthquake prone. In fact, this area is also earthquake prone. Monsoon floods are present here. Drought is present in Vidarbha region. Cyclones from Western Pacific and Andaman Sea and so on. So this is basically vulnerability risk assessment in a loose format. But vulnerability risk assessment is more deep than this. In fact, this diagram is technically wrong. This diagram basically is trying to assess the kind of is trying to tell you the kind of disasters India has. Vulnerability risk assessment is to look at different areas in a minute manner and see all the vulnerabilities that particular area is prone to, and then you grade all these areas based on the proneness to a particular disaster. Like for example, why do we have zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4 and zone 5? Zone 2, not zone 1, sorry, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, zone 5 under earthquakes. Like for example, Shivaliks, Ran of Kutch, etc. come under a very high earthquake prone region. And of course, if you take the Deccan Plateau region, Deccan Plateau is tectonically very stable, and this comes under very poor risk region. So this is a situation in which you have assessed the risk, and having assessed the risk, you have also graded the risk, and based on the kind of impact it could create on livelihood, on the ecosystem and people as such. That is vulnerability risk assessment in a pre-disaster kind of situation. Anyway, let's move forward and look at what he says. So moving forward, he is talking about the importance of risk assessment. Risk mitigation, as per NDMA guidelines, Sendai framework would become possible. Alright. So when you have assessed the risk, you can mitigate the risk. This point could have been probably handled better. Risk assessment is basically a prerequisite in order to mitigate the risk and in order to handle the post-disaster situation better. And you can also reduce the impact of disaster because of preparedness. When you assess the risk, you will immediately take up measures in order to handle the situation. Like for example, I know that a particular area is earthquake prone. See, take the example of Bhuj itself. Bhuj has had a very devastating earthquake in 2001 and so on. Then people have realized that this particular region is prone to earthquakes. So what they've done is that they've started creating earthquake resistant structures Firstly, the kind of buildings that they are creating there, the building norms you find in Bhuj, they are basically quite stronger. They create structures which are earthquake resilient, and you cannot create structures which are huge, as in very lengthy, like skyscrapers kind of structures in Bhuj, because that is definitely going to fall even if you have a mild earthquake, however safe you construct it. So in that area, these measures are being taken. If you look at the roads are quite wide, because if an earthquake occurs, people can come onto the road and move or run. So these kinds of steps have been made. So this is called preparedness, and this preparedness comes when you have assessed the risk. If I don't know what kind of risk is present in my locality, as a district administrator, what will I do? As an MLA or maybe a minister, what will I do? State minister or central minister? If I don't know what the situation is, how will I respond? So in order to respond, I need to have this vulnerability risk assessment. So you also have the situation of planned developments, like for example, you can have wide roads in earthquake prone regions. Moving forward, development of standard operating procedures. These standard operating procedures are important, and these standard operation procedures usually kick in immediately just before the disaster occurs. So whenever there is going to be a cyclone, alerts are basically given out into the coastal community. Immediately there is evacuation. Immediately these people are sent to shelter camps. Immediately the boats, etc., are all called back to the shore. The fishermen are prevented from going into the fishing. Right? So these standard operating procedures can be created if you have assessed your risk better. Next is areas of focus for an administrator. As an administrator, what are the things that you can focus on? Vulnerable sections 1. Supply chains have to be rejuvenated. Media management, coordination, procedures. So this is basically a GS4 kind of answer ho gaya ye to. You should basically write technical points. So this is a GS4 kind of content. What is more preferable? Areas of focus for an administrator. Pre-disaster point of view se likho, post-disaster point of view se likho, during the disaster point of view se likho. Media management, etc., etc. All these things can be written, but in addition to this, what are the specific things that you can do? Implementation of laws like NDMA and so on. Right? You can also basically tie up with the civil society, as in develop mechanisms in the society in order to create awareness among the people, right? In order to create a system in which everything becomes automatic, right? What I mean by that is, whenever there is going to be a disaster or whenever there is a disaster, automatic procedures have to kick in and people should be saved automatically, and those kind of procedures have to be developed. These are the kind of points you have to write. And what are these automatic kind of procedures present in NDMA Act, or what are these procedures which you can see in Sendai framework or maybe in sustainable development goals? These things can be talked about in this particular aspect. Right. Moving forward, in addition to this, proper documentation of experiences of administrator can go a long way in handling disasters in the long run. Now this answer might look like a good answer, but the truth is this answer is average, if not below average answer, because this is GS4 content, especially the last 1/4 of your answer. Write technical points, write some of the technical points in your notes and in the comment section. Spread knowledge. Now let's move forward. Look at the question for tomorrow. So here is a question for tomorrow. In India, there appears to be more disaster of management than management of disaster. So this is a tricky question. It's not tricky per se. It takes some time to interpret, but itna bhi difficult nahi hai. You can clearly see that what it is trying to tell you is the fact that the way in which we manage our disasters is itself a disaster. This is also a public administration optional question. I want you to keep that in mind. But in general, this has figured in disaster management as well. So what is this question trying to tell you, and how do you segregate this particular question into the different side headings that we do and evolve points under this particular question? And he's asking you to comment. Right. So this should be the discussion for the day. I'll meet you tomorrow. Thank you for your participation.